When it comes to making positive change in our lives, we're usually told that in order to see big change, you have to make big changes. If you want to lose weight, you need this big, new, extreme diet. If you want to make a heap more money, you need to work a whole heap harder. But that tends not to be the case. It turns out that we can actually achieve big results by just introducing small, consistent changes. As human beings, we tend to overestimate the importance of singular and defining moments in our life, while also underestimating the power of making small improvements on a daily basis. We tend to put enormous pressure on ourselves to come up with some massive achievement that everyone will talk about. Meanwhile, improving just a tiny bit isn't very noticeable, but it can be far more meaningful. Imagine for a second that you're the pilot flying a plane in a straight line from London to New York. If you were to tilt the nose of that plane so it's even just a few tiny degrees off course, then over the course of that flight, that tiny little change will be amplified, and by the time you get across the Atlantic, you'll be in a completely different state, or maybe even a completely different country. In other words, that tiny change over the duration of the journey made a massive difference. This way of thinking absolutely applies to our lives too. You don't necessarily need big wholesale changes in your life to see that positive change. Just one or two little adjustments each day. Importantly, things that you know you can stick to. And over the course of your journey, over time, these tiny changes will add up to a massive improvement. So I've recently been reading the book Atomic Habits by James Clear. This book explores that idea, the idea of making small changes on a daily basis, with a particular focus on how to form habits that will lead to long-term positive change. And I have genuinely really enjoyed reading this book. I love how down to earth it seems. It's jam-packed with real-life examples of useful, practical, and applicable tips and tricks that we can use, and it's all backed up by science and psychology, so it's right up my street. James opens his book by telling the story of possibly the most famous example of how making 1% changes adds up to a big difference in the long term. It's the story of British cycling. Before 2003, the British cycling team had just endured around 100 years of complete mediocrity. Since the year 1908, they had won a singular gold medal at the Olympics, and they had never won a Tour de France. Ever. Even though the race had been around for over 100 years. So in 2003, they hired a new performance coach called Dave Brailsford. Dave Brailsford was completely committed to the strategy of searching for tiny improvements in everything that you do. A strategy which he lovingly referred to as the aggregation of marginal gains. So he set about starting to make those 1% improvements that the other teams were probably making too. He put slightly lighter tyres on the bikes. He had the riders wear electrically heated overshorts to keep their legs warm so they could ride for longer. He had different biofeedback sensors that each rider would wear, which allowed the training to be adjusted for each individual. All changes which were likely to be fairly commonplace in the competitive field of cycling. But he then went on to make a bunch of 1% changes that nobody else would have thought of. He hired a surgeon to come in and teach the riders how to wash their hands effectively to reduce the risk of catching the cold or getting the flu. He split tested different types of massage gels to see which one led to the fastest form of muscle recovery. He even figured out the type of pillow and mattress that led to the best night's sleep for each individual rider, and not only that, but then brought them on the road with them to big events, even abroad. Brailsford was adamant that if they executed all these little 1% changes, that the team would drastically improve. And they did. During the 10-year span from 2007 to 2017, British cyclists won 178 World Championships, 66 Olympic and Paralympic gold medals, and managed 5 Tour de France victories, despite having not won a single one in the previous 100 years. So it's kind of clear to me that this obviously works to some extent, or at least it does for the Olympians amongst us. But where does the power of the 1% change lie when it comes down to us mere mortals? Well, according to James Clear, it all comes down to the power of compounding. Clear says that habits are the compound interest of self-improvement. Anyone who knows anything about personal finance will already be able to tell me that compounding can be amazingly powerful, both positively and negatively, if we leave it to develop over a period of time. Just like compound interest, time is your friend when it comes to forming good habits. Just one tiny positive change now, compounding over years, can make a huge difference. In fact, if you look at this from a purely logical and mathematical sense, you can look at it like this. If you could improve a particular skill 1% every single day for a year, by the end of that year, you wouldn't just be 365% better. You'd actually be 3,778% better, or over 37 times as good as you were at the start of that year. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but it is true, which is amazing news for us. But on the other side of that coin, making small negative changes here and there can have an equally catastrophic negative effect. Each 1% you move in the downwards direction over time compounds to constantly tend toward rock bottom, to absolute zero. Alright, if you're not as much of a nerd as I am and that just looked like a whole bunch of meaningless numbers and graphs to you, you might find it a little bit more useful to think of it like this. Imagine you're out for lunch and you have a choice of two meals. You can either have a salad or you can have a big fat burger and chips. Now, on any one individual occasion, you won't necessarily notice the difference between the two. When you step on the scales the next day, they'll read more or less the same. When you look in the mirror, your body looks pretty much the same. You don't feel particularly different either, but after a year, 2 years, 5 years, or even 10 years, the impact of that one small decision here and there will add up one way or another depending whether you chose the salad or the burger. I think the biggest problem here is that we have become so accustomed in our society to seek out instant gratification that it becomes a lot more difficult for us to focus on the things that have a long-term benefit, and we allow these bad habits to creep back in. It's no secret that we live in a massively outcomes-focused society at the moment. You know, things only become news stories or they only get shared on social media once they've happened. So for all of us, the results of success are really visible and really easy to see, which means that we naturally put more emphasis on the short term and can sometimes struggle to see the small daily decisions as the sort of pieces that make up the bigger long-term picture. Now, although this might seem kind of easy and obvious on paper, we all kind of know that it's not as simple as this. To go back to the plane analogy I used at the very beginning, we know that planes rarely fly in a straight line. Things like bad weather, strong winds can easily take that plane off course. But the pilot of the plane doesn't let that ruin the journey. When the pilot notices the plane just veering slightly off course, they just make the necessary adjustments to bring it back on course. They make the tiny changes needed to bring that plane back on its trajectory, back in the intended direction of its journey. Which just goes to show that tiny changes matter.